You again for this opportunity. I'm excited to introduce today's speaker. For more than 20 years, she's served in numerous high-profile positions with the state of California. For the past 4 years, representing the current and previous administrations, she has served as the state's chief fiscal policy advisor. Before leading the California Department of Finance, she was Governor Jerry Brown's cabinet secretary. Altogether, she has been directly involved with the development and approval of 9 state budgets. Please join me in welcoming Department of Finance Director Keely Martin Bosler.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here, and I can safely say this is one of my final public speaking events before I exit as the director. But it's been an absolute pleasure and an amazing opportunity, especially through the last 2 years, which I'll touch on in my presentation, to be the Director of Finance and to lead this department that is involved in so much. And if you haven't met with different members of my team in your advocacy in Sacramento, I would encourage you to put the department on your list of people to meet with, because we have a really amazing team here at the Department of Finance, incredible depth of knowledge about different program areas across all of government, and we get to touch so many things through the budget process. So it's a really unique place in government, and one that it's been such a privilege to lead. But I will get a little into the presentation. I wanted to start with, see, it's not moving forward. Oop, there we are. Start with this chart that my chief economist put together for me, and this is actually California job losses. And the different colors represent the different recessions that we've experienced here in California. Many of you, I'm sure, remember the Great Recession. It started in 2007 and went all the way till 2014. That's the green dotted line. The red dotted line is, of course, the COVID recession. The purplish one is the early 1990s. And then the light blue one at the very top is the dot-com bust that happened at the very beginning of the 2000s. And why I think this is interesting is it really illustrates how different the COVID-19 recession was. It's now the shortest recession in recorded history, but it also had the deepest and largest impact on unemployment and significant lasting impacts on low-income households, especially, that were the hardest hit by the recession. So I really grew up in working on budgets during this green period, the Great Recession, which was certainly one of the most challenging times in state government history, working on the budget and the significant fiscal crisis that we had during that time. But the COVID-19 recession created its own challenges for the state and for everyone, obviously, that we had that shared experience. But while it was the deepest in terms of job losses, and it was also the shortest, and we are now set to recover, and we're actually just about recovered in terms of jobs lost and the jobs that we had before the pandemic started. So this is just to illustrate how unusual and a time that we just lived through. Of course, when the other thing I wanted to leave is timing is everything. So for those of you not that familiar with our budget process, the governor's budget comes out on January 10th every year. That's in the Constitution. That means we're putting our forecasts together really in the very first week of December. So that is when we put down our economic forecast, our revenue forecast that's ultimately incorporated into the governor's budget. So early December is a key point. Then the May revision comes out every year around May 14th. That date's actually in statute. But we are usually finalizing our May revision forecast in late April. I'm trying to get as much information from those April daily cash pieces of information as possible to incorporate into our forecast. And so in late April is when we had, in 2020, is when we were putting together our forecast for the May revision. That was the 2021 May revision. And that was obviously at the very beginning still of the pandemic, when we did not have vaccines. We did not have a lot of information about when this free fall that we were all experiencing at that time was going to end. And so at that time, we used all of the information we could, surveyed a whole lot of economists in California and beyond about how to do our forecast that year. We ended up, frankly, being wildly wrong. It was not as bad from a revenue perspective as we expected. But that was all the information we had at the time. We then made a very large revision upward the next January. Of course, again, timing is everything, because at that point, we did not have the knowledge that the federal government was going to pass yet another stimulus bill that would significantly improve the economic forecast that our budget was based on. And so again, we had revised our estimates significantly up. But then again, next, fast forward to a year ago in May of 2021, we had another sizable revision upward in our budget forecast. Mainly because of some very significant actions by the federal government that allowed more federal money to be in the economy to prop up those that had been impacted by the recession and by the pandemic. But also because at the end of the day, we in California have a very progressive tax system. That means that we collect a lot of tax revenues from the highest income people in California. And frankly, those families' household incomes were far less changed than those in the lower income tax brackets. And so at the end of the day, our revenues just were not impacted in the same way that they were in the Great Recession and in prior recessions as well. So that's sort of the story of the last 2 years, the last 3 budgets now. I would say the 2020 was the worst of times, the 2021, and then again in 2022. We have surpluses that, frankly, having worked on budgets for over 20 years, I couldn't imagine. The numbers that we've seen in recent years are frankly staggering as compared to the kinds of surpluses that the prior administration, for example, had. And I had the pleasure of working under Michael Cohen, the prior director, as his chief deputy for several years. And sometimes I pinch myself thinking about the amount of discretionary funds that we had to allocate even just a short few years ago versus the last 2 budgets, where we've had tens of billions of dollars of what we call discretionary funding. These are funds that are that the governor and the legislature have more flexibility to allocate amongst expenditure priorities because they are not required by the Constitution to be for other purposes. This is another chart I just wanted to highlight. This is capital gains realizations. And so if you go all the way to the right, that's where we are right now in terms of capital gains realizations. This is a very, very volatile source of income for the revenues for the state of California, as you can see from the way in which it goes up and it goes down. And you can track the 2 different peaks here at 2000, at the year 2000, that's the .com bust. And then again, of course, the Great Recession as well. So this is one of the factors that makes budgeting in California really challenging. And it's one of the reasons we have a very significant rainy day fund policy and that we put so much emphasis on building adequate reserves, because this source of revenue during very good economic times provides a lot significant additional revenues to the state, but it also, what goes up often, it always obviously comes down at some point, and it's become a growing source of volatility, which makes us need to plan in different ways in order to maintain fiscal integrity for the state. And that is one of the things that's my primary job as the director of finance, is to have that longer term view. And it's one of the reasons why just a few short years ago, we really started adopting a multi-year look for budgeting, because of how fleeting many of these revenues can be that are mainly derived from the income tax. It was really important for us to be planning ahead and realizing that the revenues that we're seeing now are not necessarily going to continue into the future. And that's a really important central tenet of how we build our revenue forecasts here at the Department of Finance, is not counting on these very revenues that have a lot of, are not reoccurring. That's one of the other reasons why when the governor put his budget together, there was very few opportunities where we did new ongoing, or what we call statutory spending. Statutory spending is much harder to change. Just like a very big ship, it's very difficult to quickly reduce some types of spending that are in that we have in the state budget. And some of it is obviously controlled by the state constitution, including Proposition 98, which funds our schools and community colleges, as well as many of the entitlement spending, which is not in the Constitution, but is in state statute. And there are other limitations, as we experienced during the Great Recession, around not being able to reduce some of that spending because of the federal government's rules, because of other lawsuits that have been brought against the state in prior years. And so there are a lot of limitations in being able to reduce large parts of the budget. The other thing about the overall general fund budget, I will say, is that some of our spending, especially in the areas of health and human services, has a counter-cyclical affect. So it actually, in some cases, those caseloads and the spending on those programs will actually grow significantly at the same time that the economy is doing worse and revenues are coming in lower. So these are all things that we have to take into consideration here at the department as we're building budgets and making recommendations to the governor. A few other things I want to talk about in terms of our overall fiscal foundation that we focus on here is really focused on structurally balanced budgets. What does that mean? That means revenues exceed expenditures in each of the subsequent years over our multi-year, which is the budget year plus an additional 3 fiscal years. Again, I already mentioned the reserves. We do have a rainy day fund that is in the Constitution that requires a certain amount of money transferred depending on that capital gains rate, and also an additional 1.5% every year. So we have those reserves. The rainy day fund is actually restricted, so it can't be, money cannot be taken out of that reserve unless there is a fiscal emergency, which we did experience in 2020. And that was the first time actually we'd used that provision since that law was enacted. I talked a little bit already about the one-time versus ongoing spending. In fact, this budget that the governor just signed on June 30th has 93% allocated to one-time expenditures. One of the things you probably heard the former Governor Jerry Brown talk about was the wall of debt and the budgetary debts. One of the things the state built up during those great recessions was a significant amount, during the Great Recession, was a significant amount of budgetary debt. And this was all paid off by Governor Newsom in the first year of his administration. And then in this year, to add additional resiliency, we actually have a multi-year plan to switch bond-funded projects to cash. And these are infrastructure projects that we routinely would issue bonds to pay for. But instead, we are proposing to allocate the funds up front with cash and avoid those interest costs. We're doing that on several high-profile projects here in the Sacramento area, including the renovation of the state capitol. If you've been to Sacramento lately, you'll notice a lot of cranes and construction workers. We're finally remodeling and renovating what's called the Capitol Annex that was built in the 1950s, and that will be a really important project over the next few years that will hopefully last for many, many decades after that. But that's one of the projects that we had planned to fund with lease revenue bonds, and we're instead using cash. Then we also continue to make progress on reducing the retirement liabilities. Obviously, the performance of the stock market is also having a lot of impact on that as well. But as part of Proposition 2, which was the initiative that created the Rainy Day Fund, there was also a commitment to continue to pay off debts, and the last remaining debt that's eligible at this point in the Constitution are our retirement liabilities. So every year we're able to allocate additional monies to continue to reduce and improve the funded status of our retirement funds, both CalSTRS and CalPERS. And move to the next slide. So this year, the centerpiece of the budget was really this broad-based relief concept. Obviously, everyone is facing incredibly unique inflationary conditions. And that's why the governor wanted to issue a refund that was broad-based as well. We've got over $17 billion in direct relief, with the centerpiece being $9.5 billion for refunds of up to $1,050 for many Californians. Californians up to joint filers up to $500,000 and single filers of $250,000. And the way that the refund is sized is really with those lower income households receiving a larger refund, and also the size of your household also being a factor in determining the size of the refund check. But that's not the only relief that's provided in the budget. There are also direct relief for rental assistance, utility arrearages. We're waiving family fees for subsidized childcare. We have reinstated healthcare subsidies with state funds for the middle class since the federal government has not continued those that they approved during the pandemic. There are also retention bonuses for thousands of healthcare workers. And then there is also relief for small businesses impacted by the pandemic in a couple different ways. One of them is by the waiver of the sales tax on diesel for an entire year. And since most diesel is consumed by business, that will be a direct relief for those businesses. And then there's additional grants to small businesses related to the additional sick leave that has been extended due to the pandemic. If I had one word to describe the remainder of the budget after relief, it would be infrastructure, and all of the infrastructure investments, the vast majority of them really have a common thread, which is addressing the impacts of climate change. And this is exactly with these types of one-time revenues. These are the kinds of investments that will have a lasting impact on the state and are really important. We've got $39 billion that is scheduled over a multi-year period towards climate resilience, including obviously something that's top of mind for all Californians right now, which is the drought, immediate drought relief, but also investments in projects that will provide long-term water resilience. The next one that I'm sure many of your companies are also keenly are closely following is the energy reliability here in the state of California. There's just several factors that are aligning, not in a good way, that are impacting the state's energy reliability. And so there's a significant and unique outlay of funds this year in the budget to develop a strategic reserve. And this is focused directly on ensuring reliability over the next several summers as more of our energy resources that are old and dirty are phasing out. And also while we're continuing to bring on those green sources. And at the same time, the drought that's impacting the entire Western United States is having impacts on some of the hydroelectric resources that we have for a very long time depended on and more so as we've switched off of fossil fuels and onto a more greener energy portfolio. So in addition to the strategic reserves, there's also a focus on accelerating more clean energy projects in the state. Another aspect of this, the use of the state's general fund to create these reserves is also to alleviate some of the upward pressure on utility rates that everyone is paying as well. The next one is obviously wildfires. They have been a huge part of my executive branch career going back into the Brown administration. Each year, I think, how could it get worse than the last year? And for many years, it has. We do have some very significant investments in ongoing funding for our CAL FIRE department, which is our primary firefighters here in the state. And then in terms of additional technology, helicopters, air tanker resources, but also more staffing at CAL FIRE, but also some additional crews at our state military department, as well as our California Conservation Corps. But we're also investing in the prevention work as well. Transportation, this is also a very large budget for transportation as it relates to the general fund. Most transportation funding is what we call special funds, or they have very dedicated tax resources that go to transportation. But there's a significant investment in this budget from the general fund for transportation projects, and mainly all regional transit and rail projects. And then this budget also includes the final remaining general obligation bonds for the high-speed rail as well. And then finally, housing, another issue that many of your companies via being employers in the state, I'm sure are anxious to know what the state's doing, and that's in terms of accelerating the development of more housing. Often the state's role is in helping to fund the affordable components of those housing projects. And I've been really working hard to utilize excess state lands and break down other barriers, including investing in local infrastructure to help facilitate the development of more housing around the state. We need to keep building more housing, but we need to do that in a way that is compatible with our climate goals in terms of developing more housing near transportation, resources, as well as in downtown areas. Healthcare affordability, I've touched on this already. The governor committed in January to universal access to health coverage, regardless of immigration status. This is in the final budget. It will be implemented in January of 2024, as there are a lot of pre-work that needs to be done before we are able to migrate all of those additional lives onto the state's Medi-Cal system. Pairing with that, which is really important, is this new Office of Healthcare Affordability. Now that we have universal access to health coverage in California, we are in a much better position to really think about the system more globally, increase transparency of pricing, and develop cost targets for different sectors of the industry, so we can really continue to put pressure, downward pressure on the per unit costs of healthcare. I think it's well documented about how expensive the US system is of healthcare compared to other developed countries around the world. And so this is a really necessary component of the work we're doing here in California. Of course, the state is part of a much larger federal healthcare system, both Medicare and Medicaid. And so there's a lot that we'll be working with the feds over the next several years to address these issues as well. And then finally, given the US Supreme Court decision around Roe versus Wade, this budget expands access to reproductive health care services in a number of different ways. Another one of the pressing needs that I think is on everybody's mind in California right now is homelessness, and also addressing behavioral health needs. Unfortunately, there's a lot of overlap often between individuals experiencing homelessness and also those that are have untreated schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders. There's significant investments in the last two budgets for the building and purchasing of motels and other types of facilities that can be more cheaply converted into homeless housing or interim housing. There's additional money this year, as well as additional grants for encampment cleanups. The governor is also pursuing a policy that is called Care Court, and this is really another tool in the toolbox for courts and counties and the state to utilize to help assist people getting into treatment that are living on the streets with untreated schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders. We are also putting significant funds into the community to help treat individuals who are deemed incompetent to stand trial. This is an aspect, something that you probably don't always know about, but the state has, we have state hospitals or mental hospitals, but we do not have enough of them, and we do not have enough beds because there is a large waiting list of individuals who have been deemed by a court to be incompetent to stand trial that are awaiting transfer to one of our state hospitals. And some of these individuals, or a lot of these individuals, there's a lot of overlap with the homeless population and those that are living with untreated disorders. And so because it is obviously much less expensive to be able to treat people in the community as opposed to transferring them to a state hospital, there's a significant investment in funds to do that where appropriate. We've also doing more on mobile crisis and medication assisted treatment. And then also there's been a large opioid settlement that's also going to enable more funds for drug treatment services in communities. Just a little bit, and then I will end, and I'm happy to take questions. Obviously, the pandemic, which has been on the front burner for all of us for the last 2 years and continues to be impacting our day-to-day lives. The governor's budget continues its efforts, especially around school testing and increasing vaccination rates across the state, including the boosters. and of course the 0 to 5 vaccines that have just been recently approved. And then another effort that we have is at the border, at the California-Mexico border, is assisting and sustaining the efforts there to make sure and protect public health for those individuals entering our country, and making sure that there's screening and testing and vaccinations available, and also that individuals are safely transported to their final destinations in the United States. Then finally, in terms of public safety, the governor has made a significant effort around expanding efforts around organized retail theft, and also fentanyl enforcement, two, I think, issues that have been on the forefront over the last year. But I'm going to end it there, and I'm happy to answer any questions. That was the 30,000-foot explanation of what's in the state budget. And around here at the Department of Finance, we are already starting to work on next year's budget. Of course, hopefully people are taking some vacation days right now, but we are already fast at work for the next budget. So it's always a good time to come and talk to the Department of Finance early about ideas you have or opportunities you would like to see.
Thank you, Keely. Thank you so much for that information, that overview for this historic budget. It seems like they keep getting more historic every year, but this one is definitely unique. One thing I want to ask you about, you mentioned 93% of the spending was discretionary. What does that mean? Does that mean next year that number will be different, or that, you know, that's not recurring funding?
Yeah, no. So 93% of what is deemed discretionary is on one-time expenditures. But when we talk about discretionary versus non-discretionary, we're really talking about the constitutional formulas that govern the general fund spending. So whenever we start our budget process, it always starts with our revenue forecast. We then have our Proposition 98 team, our K-14 team, do all of their calculations. That is a very complicated formula, but it's been made more simple because we are now in what we call a Test 1, which is about 38% of the state general fund is required to be spent on school spending. So that is not discretionary. That has to be spent on schools. It's going to be growing a little bit because we rebenched the guarantee, because we are adding a 14th year of school with the preschool, or the pre-K. TK is another term people use. And that's happening over the next several years, but that's not discretionary. The other thing that's not discretionary is Proposition 2, which is our deposits into the rainy day fund and our dedicated payments and to pay down the state's debts, which at this point are the retirement liabilities. So that is all what we call mandatory. We also then have workload that is all of the caseload. So our current Medi-Cal spending based on just updated caseloads, and CalWorks, another one of our entitlement programs, Cal Grants, the scholarships for individuals attending CSU, UC, and community colleges. All of those things are what we call workload, and so that's not considered discretionary. So after we do all the caseload, Prop 98, Prop 2, then we come up with a number that is discretionary. And this is something that those that have worked around budget will notice. There's a subtlety here. I mean, obviously the constitutional pieces are very clear cut, but the LAO and finance will have different numbers sometimes about what is discretionary. And that mainly has to do with their view, looking at what we have deemed as mandatory, And they sometimes say, well, the legislature has discretion to change that too. So we do often have different numbers on what the surplus is. And that's okay. We have different viewpoints, but it can be very confusing for people. And H.D. Palmer, my longtime, our longtime spokesperson for the department, he has the pleasure of explaining those differences often to the press.
Thank you. Thank you. So our audience is the technology industry, and we do have state IT staff on the line as well. Usually we do a pretty good mix. So just shifting the conversation a little bit to the technology industry perspective, we don't have enough time. There wouldn't be enough time to get into the individual initiatives, the budget items, and we didn't plan on doing that today. But I was wondering if you could talk about, at a very high level, what the industry should be paying attention to, the governor's perspective. We know that he has a lot of things to say about the technology industry. He's probably the only governor that's written a book about it. Yeah. And you talk to him, daily. I was wondering if you could just share with us some of the administration's perspective on, overall the direction for technology and some things that might be on his mind.
Yeah, no, I mean, I look on the horizon about the bread and butter running of state government, and I see so many opportunities for investment. And it's something the governor has given us very, very, as a government, specific direction. And that's why you've seen some of these technology innovation funds and different things that we've been working to get off the ground even before the pandemic. And some of those things we really had to shift gears because of course we put up a lot of technology solutions in an emergency way during the pandemic. But I think we learned a lot as well in those processes, even though they were very painful at times. And so I think there's a lot that now that we're moving into a more quote unquote normal cadence of government operations, really thinking about how to accelerate the development. But there are so many different aspects. I mean, first of all, we have so many large legacy systems that are really not meeting current needs. They are not nimble. They are not able to be modified. And in some cases, barely fixed because the technologies are so obsolete and old. And so we have on the horizon, for example, our payroll system, major big change for the state, and a lot of really good excitement around that project and all of the additional capabilities that are going to come with that upgrade. And then of course in the health and human services area, there are so many. Sometimes I myself, even though I get briefed at least twice a year on those projects, get a little confused because there are so many of them, and they often need to integrate or don't integrate very well. So all of those bread and butter systems, we are going to continue to have specific, very sensitive information, lots of security issues, lots of things that we need to work out and be able to be more nimble around. But then the other thing that the governor has been so focused on, which actually makes me really exciting, because I did not grow up in a government family. I grew up my parents are small business owners. And so I know that time is money for people, and every time they have to interact with government, and it's not that easy to go on a website and figure out how to pay your fees or figure out how to file your taxes. That is time that is not spent doing other important things that you have to do. So the idea of really being able to go across state government, make it more consumer friendly, like what we've been doing with DMV, many of the consumer affairs boards as well, trying to really improve the customer experience for people interacting with government. I think we have just scratched the surface on that, and there's a lot of interest in doing a lot more there. The third category, though, I want to mention also is really using data to not just inform management decisions, which is really important, but also to provide dashboards, provide progress reports to the public. This is something the governor is really focused on and interested in, and really thinking about how we use data that we're able to collect through all these different technology solutions, and better display that, and provide, again, that more Main Street access to what the people's government is doing for them.
Thank you. Okay, well, so if anyone has questions, just go ahead and type them into the chat here. That's how we're going to handle these. I see we have a couple already. What are the projections for population increases in California, and what groups are?
Yes, thank you for asking. One of my
Jerry.
favorite parts of my department is our demographers and the demographics. We always say that our favorite, one of my favorite briefings every year is when they come over and talk to me about their updated population projections. We, for the first time, had a negative population growth, which has not occurred. And there were a lot of factors that all culminated to have that occur. Some of it was related to the pandemic. Some of it was related to very stark changes in international migration patterns that started prior to the pandemic and the prior administration at the federal level. And then finally, the thing that has gone up and gone down as you look at history, and especially over those different recessionary periods, is the domestic migration. How many people are moving into California versus out of California? And in the last several years, even prior to the pandemic, we started to see some upward trends in outmigration out of the state, but nothing at the level of those early 90s. If you go back to the early 90s recession, that was a recession that hit California harder than some of the other states because of the defense industry's large declines in California. And so that we saw almost double outmigration from what we've been seeing, but we have seen an uptick in outmigration. And the thing that's different about it this time is that we are seeing people from more income groups moving. So historically, it's been very much lower income groups that have migrated out of the state. But now we're seeing it at higher income groups as well. So that's something that they'll keep. Obviously, it was Christmas for demographers when the 2020 census data has been coming out, and especially all of the detailed data. And so they've really been spending a lot of time with that data, and then obviously the impacts of the pandemic. I think we're still really understanding how that changed births and deaths. Obviously, we have a term we call excess deaths that was significant due to the pandemic, and births have been on a pretty steep decline for many decades now, and that's been really impacting our school age population significantly, especially in urban areas.
Thank you. Okay, so next question.
But if you don't know, in our January budget, we always have a whole chapter on demographics, and I would recommend reading that because it's always just interesting to understand more about the state.
Absolutely. Well, as someone who's worked in state government, I've spent a bit of time looking at your website and going through the budget summaries and so on. Maybe that's sort of a nerdy thing to do, but it's really rich. I mean, if you really want to know what's happening in state government programs, that's the place to go, because you see where the funding is and the movement and where obviously the priorities are. So besides the TechCA.org website, where you can find some great detailed information, then alternatively, I suppose you could go to the Department of Finance website. I'm being a little facetious there, but so next question. So what is the time frame to pay off the state debt? And are you looking at savings from real estate consolidation per the hybrid workforce?
Yeah, I mean, two really good questions. We don't have a plan to pay off all of the state's general obligation and lease revenue bond debt. We are doing some of it. We routinely do use bonds to finance infrastructure, and that we will continue to do. But we did identify some bonds that we could call up early, and we're planning to do that, implement that in not in the budget year, but in budget year +1, or in 23-24, the fiscal year. And then the lease revenue bond debt, these are projects that we hadn't got to the point of issuing the debt yet, because usually we use short-term loans to start the projects and get almost to the final before we actually execute and sell the bonds. So in both of those cases, we're doing more to use our current money to avoid interest, but we aren't doing that for all state debts. In terms of real estate, this is such a good question. We started actually in the prior administration, because obviously Sacramento has a significant amount of infrastructure around state government in the downtown area specifically. And we actually started this multi-year phase plan to look at how to better utilize the space that we have downtown near the Capitol. And so that has been ongoing, and we continue to do that. Obviously, and I actually would love to have conversation with many of you who have large workforces. The office work and working from home, we are not in a steady state yet across state government. I know my own experience with my own department. We have around 400 individuals that work for the Department of Finance. And we've made decisions to bring people back into the office 2 days a week with an emphasis on bringing teams in together. That has been hard during the spring and summer, early summer, where we're seeing a very increase in cases here in Sacramento County, and even in our own office having to send people home because of positive cases. So, this is something that state departments across government are all working on putting telework plans in place. I do believe that government was one of the places where very little flexibility existed prior to the pandemic. It was much more traditional. You work at work, you do not work at home. That's, I think, changed forever for many state departments, and I think that's a good thing. I think it's going to be good for the retention of employees. It's going to be a good thing for retention of people that have other family obligations. But every department is going to have to put together a plan, submit that to the Department of General Services, and then we are also working on that secondary analysis of the space needs, because it's hard to justify if people are working 100% from remotely, or even if it's a couple days a month. You can't necessarily, you need to be really thinking about how you're redesigning your space to include more hoteling options, et cetera. And I know some of our newer buildings have already been set up with that in mind. But we certainly have a lot of traditional space. And then the truth of the matter is we have a lot of state-owned buildings, but we are still in a lot of lease space around Sacramento and certainly throughout the state as well. And so the first priority is getting us out of some of those lease spaces and better utilizing the state-owned buildings.
Okay, let's see. So this is from Shauna. The Department of Finance budget website shows all BCPs, but 0 modified or rejected by the
Yeah, that doesn't seem correct. That's not correct. That's not what happened. So let me find out why it's showing that. It may be that we're still in the process of updating that component. I remember not very many years ago, the BCPs were not posted on the internet, and now they are. And so I think there is quite a bit of work that goes into now on the back end, cleaning up what was modified or rejected. But no, we didn't get everything that we proposed.
Good catch. Well, so in terms of the budget process, though, so the budget was signed by the governor and, within the deadline. What other activities are happening related to the budget? Like I see there's some, maybe trailer bills still going through. Can you describe?
Yeah, no, I mean, we, most everything around the budget has been settled, and significant number of trailer bills that were signed by the governor all around June 30th. There are a few areas, and this is how it happened last year as well. The legislature, and I used to work on that side, so I know how compressed their time frame is. But the time frame between May 14th and June 15th, I mean, it's 30 days. They have a lot of information to process. They have a lot of hearings to hold and actions to take. And there were some areas of the budget, mainly in the climate area, where there was just a desire to have more time to be thoughtful and think through how the legislature's priorities were slightly different than the administration's, and how to come to a agreed upon conclusion there. We did that last year. The amount of money is set right now, so we know that we have 500+ million for wildfire prevention, and so the conversation with the legislature in August will be on how to allocate that 500 million. There are a few pieces of trailer bill language that we propose that we will continue to work with the legislature. Again, a lot of complex law, a lot of considerations, and so we will continue to work with them in August. But as far as the budget document, I mean, the budget is done, and we will be we're working on the next one already. So
great. Well, so in terms of the IT staff, the state staff that are with us today or watching this later, what advice do you have for the managers and the folks who are preparing for next year's budget?
Well, I actually have some very specific advice, and it's always good. And these are actually posted online. They're called our budget letters, and they're the instructions we put out to all of government on how and what the governor's priorities are for the upcoming budget. And one of the things that I put in the letter as we were preparing for the May revision was really on investments that state government, different departments may want to make that really promote the responsible resource allocation. We have allocated a lot of money for a lot of different projects, some things we've never done before. We are going to want to be able to have metrics and evaluate the performance and provide dashboards to the public about what has been accomplished with that money. Those things are not just created in a day. Somebody has to really design an accountability structure within their department to do that. And so I really wanted the departments to be thinking critically about, okay, we have this big chunk of money for forest health. How are we going to measure what we're getting for the money and the outcomes that it's having? And the same can be said for many of the pandemic related programs that were one time. Really important for us to be able to measure what we know about the outcomes that we're getting for some of those investments. So that's one aspect of things. Obviously, the governors from the day one focus on improving customer orientation of government services and efficiency. There are many things that departments have brought to me over the years and showing me just how inefficient some of their processes are. And often that happened, and for those of you that worked around state government during the Great Recession, that we had to make such significant cuts to basic government operations that in some cases were penny wise but pound foolish. And embarrassed that I was, had to be a part of some of that, but those were very, very tough times. And it was also a time when we were doing a lot of unallocated reductions to departments' budgets. Those are not ideal because you do end up really harming the actual function of government. So important for people to look around at how they're doing things and recognize those inefficiencies and try and implement, IT solutions in some cases that can greatly streamline and improve the effectiveness of an organization and the efficiency as well. So both of those things, I would argue, are going to be well received by the Department of Finance in the coming year, and certainly are something that the governor himself routinely talks to us about.
Thank you. So we have about a minute. I wanted to fit one last question in because of your unique perspective, having worked in both the Brown administration and the current administration, and even the Schwarzenegger administration. I was wondering if you could talk, in particular, the difference between the last two administrations. Governor Brown was not known as someone who is very computer savvy or enthusiastic. And then you have on the other side, Governor Newsom, who has written a book about it. Maybe a couple words about the difference and, the stark difference there.
Yeah, no, it's been, I've had an opportunity over many years to work for a lot of different elected officials, and while I did work in the Schwarzenegger administration, it was over at the Department of Corrections, and so I can't say I know the inner workings of the governor's office as well under that administration. But the last two, they're very much a contrast in styles and experiences, and I think that's probably pretty obvious to many people. I also think it has a lot to do with the time in which I came into the administrations. With the Jerry Brown administration, I came in at the very beginning or the very tail end of his third term as governor. And so at that point, he had worked through all of the Great Recession, kind of putting everything in place, tax increase with Prop 30. And I actually got to work with Michael Cohen that year on our rating day fund. And so there were a lot of things that he had set in motion, and we were there to carry on and continue those things that he had started in that third term. With Newsom being in on the ground floor, and the way that the Department of Finance works is that they really, our department is the one that sits with the governor-elect during the transition. And so that happens almost immediately in November, and there's a special budget associated with that. Now, the director of finance doesn't always stay to make that transition, but I was in a unique situation where we were moving from one Democratic governor to another Democratic governor, and Governor Brown gave me the blessing to go and help the new governor with his first budget. I found, I saw immediately, he came with a lot of different ideas about the things that he wanted to be his mark. And I have to say that first year was a very, very wild ride as I was learning his new style and all of the different things he wanted to put his mark on, which were numerous. And that was a big adjustment for our department, and but also, really dynamic and exciting time to be thinking about building things that were new and different, and breathing life into activities, especially in the way government was managed, that people had been toiling away at, but not necessarily with as much attention as Governor Newsom gets really excited about some of that running of government activities. So I think it was, it's been a really interesting time, and then of course the pandemic that puts everything in perspective.
Absolutely. Well, we are past time just by a minute or two. So Keely, I wanted to just say thank you on behalf of TechCA for spending time with us with the technology industry, and to our audience for joining us today.